For most of your life, you've been told the same story. Poverty ends with foreign aid. Poverty ends with government programs. Poverty ends with the right politician, the right policy, the right amount of taxpayer money redistributed in the right direction. It's a comforting story. It's also almost entirely wrong, and the data to prove it has been sitting in plain sight for over 200 years, quietly ignored by every institution that profits from you not knowing it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In 1820, roughly 90% of the entire human population lived in extreme poverty. Not struggling, surviving. Less than $2 a day, no clean water, no medicine, no choice, no future. That was not the exception. That was the default state of humanity for thousands of years. And then, in what historians can only describe as the most dramatic transformation in the history of our species, that number collapsed. Today, despite a global population 8 times larger, extreme poverty sits at under 10%. Over 1 billion people lifted out of destitution in less than 2 centuries. The longest, fastest, most remarkable reduction in human suffering ever recorded. So what caused it? What was the force powerful enough to do what thousands of years of kings, empires, religions, and governments never could? It wasn't a foreign aid package. It wasn't a 5-year plan. It wasn't a committee, a czar, or a well-intentioned non-profit. It was something far simpler, far more elegant, and far more powerful than any of those things. And by the time this video is over, you're going to understand exactly what it was, why it worked, and most importantly, how understanding it can change the way you think about your own money, your own future, and your own financial freedom. Let's get into it. The enemy within. Here's something that'll make your blood boil a little. And honestly, it should. The free market, the most powerful wealth-generating system humanity has ever created, doesn't fail on its own. It gets sabotaged, not by accidents, not by bad luck, but by the very institutions that were supposedly built to protect you. Every time a new business threatens an old one, lobbyists show up in Washington with briefcases full of concerns. Every time a disruptor gets too powerful, the established players don't compete harder. They call their senator. Think about what happened in 2008. The biggest banks in America made catastrophic bets with other people's money, your money, and when those bets collapsed into one of the worst financial crises in modern history, the free market had a perfectly clear answer. Let them fail. Let stronger, smarter institutions take their place. But instead, the government handed over $700 billion in taxpayer dollars to bail out the very banks that caused the collapse. The banks kept their bonuses. You kept the bill. And somewhere in a boardroom, someone popped champagne while inflation quietly chipped away at your savings. The really maddening part? After every single one of these government-manufactured crises, the proposed solution is always more government. More regulation, more control, more intervention. The free market gets blamed for the mess, even though it was never allowed to do its job in the first place. It's like blaming the fire extinguisher for the fire, and while that blame game plays out on the news, something else is happening quietly, invisibly, directly inside your wallet. Something most people never even think to question. The wealth test. Real quick. Stop whatever you're doing for just a second. Look around you. Your phone, your car, your home, your savings account. Everything you've worked for, everything you've built. Now ask yourself one honest question. How much of what you own could survive a real economic crisis? Not a market dip, not a bad quarter, a full-blown collapse. Because here's the thing most people never stop to consider. The majority of what they call wealth is actually just numbers on a screen, denominated in a currency that a government can inflate, freeze, or devalue overnight. That's not wealth. That's an illusion of wealth dressed up in a very convincing costume. The people who actually survived the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany in the 1920s, one of the most devastating economic collapses in modern history, weren't the ones with the fattest bank accounts. Cash became so worthless so fast that people were literally burning banknotes for heat because firewood cost more than money. The ones who made it through were the ones who owned real things: land, gold, productive businesses. Assets that held value regardless of what the government printed. If you want a practical starting point, consider looking into assets like physical gold or silver, index funds tied to real productive companies, or even Bitcoin, not as a get-rich-quick scheme, but as a hedge against a system that has a very long history of letting people down. So here's your wealth test, and it's simpler than you think. If your government doubled the money supply tomorrow, which, by the way, it has the full legal power to do, how much of your net worth would still be standing? If that question makes you a little uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is your financial instincts waking up. Because the free market doesn't just teach you how economies grow, it teaches you how to think about your own money in a way that no school, no bank, and no financial advisor with a government license ever will. And speaking of things nobody ever taught you, what if the biggest tax you've ever paid was one you never even knew existed? The hidden tax. All right. Let's talk about the most dishonest tax in history. And no, it's not income tax. It's not property tax. It's not even that sneaky little fee your bank charges you for having too little money in your account. This one is invisible. It was never voted on. It doesn't show up on any receipt or any paycheck stub. And yet, it has quietly drained more wealth from ordinary people than any other financial mechanism ever invented. It's called inflation. And once you understand how it actually works, not the textbook version, but the real version, you will never look at your savings account the same way again. Here's how the trick works. When a government needs money it doesn't have, and governments always need money they don't have, it has two choices. It can raise taxes, which is politically unpopular and tends to get people voted out of office rather quickly. Or it can instruct its central bank to simply create new money out of thin air. No vote, no debate. No announcement on the evening news, just new money, quietly injected into the system. But here's the catch, that new money doesn't create new wealth. It just dilutes the value of every dollar already in existence. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods means prices rise. And when prices rise, your salary buys less, your savings buy less, and your future quietly gets a little smaller every single year. Ludwig von Mises saw this with devastating clarity almost a century ago, writing in his landmark work Human Action that inflation is not an act of God. It is a deliberate policy choice made by governments to finance their spending at your expense. Since 1971, the year the United States abandoned the gold standard under Nixon, the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. That means a dollar saved in 1971 buys less than 15 cents worth of goods today. If your grandparents tucked away $10,000 in cash that year thinking they were securing their future, that money is now worth less than $1,500 in real terms. That's not bad luck. That's not the market. That is the hidden tax, working exactly as designed. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until you see what happens when you put two countries side by side, same starting line, completely different rules, and watch where they end up a few decades later. The two worlds. Sometimes the most powerful argument isn't a theory or a chart or an economics textbook. Sometimes it's just a map. Take the Korean Peninsula. In 1945, North and South Korea were literally the same country. Same people, same culture, same language, same food, same history, same starting point. Then they were divided, and each half chose a completely different idea about how an economy should work. The North chose central planning, state control, government ownership of everything, and total isolation from global markets. The South chose economic freedom, private enterprise, open trade, and the messy, beautiful chaos of the free market. That decision was made over 70 years ago, and today the results are so staggering they almost don't seem real. South Korea is now one of the most prosperous nations on Earth, home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and a cultural export machine that's conquered global entertainment, a GDP per capita of over $30,000, a life expectancy of 83 years, a middle class that travels, invests, and builds generational wealth. North Korea, meanwhile, suffers from chronic food shortages, a GDP per capita estimated at under $1,800, and a darkness so literal that satellite images at night show the entire country blacked out while South Korea glows like a beacon. Same peninsula, same people, completely different ideas, and completely different worlds. Now, if that's not convincing enough, let's take a quick flight to South America, because Venezuela and Chile tell almost the exact same story. In 1970, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, the kind of natural advantage that should have made poverty almost impossible. Chile, by contrast, had limited natural resources and was considered a developing economy with an uncertain future. Venezuela chose socialism. It nationalized industries, imposed price controls, and built an economic system around government redistribution and political patronage. The result was one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history. Hyperinflation that exceeded 1,000% in 2018, empty supermarket shelves, and over 7 million citizens fleeing the country in what became one of the largest refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. Chile, on the other hand, embraced market reforms, privatization, and economic freedom, and today holds the highest GDP per capita in Latin America and the lowest poverty rate in the region. If you want to go deeper on this, Russ Roberts' How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life and Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics both break down these patterns in ways that are genuinely hard to argue with. Same continent, same era, completely different ideas, and once again, completely different worlds. And here's what makes all of this even more fascinating. If the evidence is this clear, this documented, this overwhelming, why on earth isn't any of this being taught in schools? What they don't want you to know. Here's a question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. If the free market has this kind of track record, if the evidence is this overwhelming, this documented, this impossible to ignore, why did you spend 12 years in school without ever hearing the name Ludwig von Mises? Why did nobody explain how the price system works, how inflation is manufactured, or how economic freedom and personal prosperity are directly and measurably linked? Why is it that most people graduate knowing how to calculate the area of a triangle, but have absolutely no idea how the monetary system that controls their entire financial life actually operates? That's not an accident. That's a curriculum. The institutions that design what gets taught in schools are government institutions. The universities that shape economic thinking receive government funding. The central banks that print money also publish the research papers that justify printing money. And those papers are written by economists whose careers depend on the approval of the very system they're supposed to be objectively analyzing. The media companies that cover economic policy depend on advertising revenue from the financial institutions that benefit most from the status quo. None of these players have any incentive to teach you that voluntary exchange creates more wealth than government planning. None of them benefit from you understanding that inflation is a policy choice, not a weather event. Thomas Sowell spent decades dissecting this pattern. His book Knowledge and Decisions is one of the most eye-opening things you'll ever read, arguing that the intelligentsia consistently advocates for government solutions, not because the evidence supports them, but because bigger government means more influence, more funding, and more relevance for the intelligentsia itself. What you're watching right now is the alternative. Not a textbook approved by a government committee, not a lecture funded by a central bank grant, not a primetime segment sponsored by a financial institution with 17 lobbyists in Washington. Just ideas, examined honestly, tested against history, and shared freely with anyone willing to listen. That is what the free market of ideas actually looks like in practice. And here's the beautiful, almost poetic irony of all of this. The same principles that explain why free markets generate prosperity, why inflation destroys savings, and why central planning always fails. Those same principles can be applied directly to your own financial decisions, starting today, starting now, with what you already have. So here we are. You've just learned what most people will never take the time to understand, and that alone puts you ahead of the curve in a world that profits from your financial ignorance. You now know that the free market isn't a political slogan or a textbook concept. It's the most powerful, most proven, most human system for generating wealth ever discovered. And more importantly, you now know how it applies directly to your life, your money, and your future. But knowing is only half the battle. So let's get real for a second. What are you actually going to do with this? Are you still going to keep all your savings in a currency that loses value every single year? Are you still going to trust a system that was designed, not by accident but by design, to keep you dependent, uninformed, and financially comfortable enough not to ask questions? Are you still going to let inflation silently tax your hard work while the people who created it face zero consequences? Or are you going to start making decisions like someone who actually understands how the game is played? Here's your challenge. This week, pick up one book, Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics or Ludwig von Mises's Human Action if you're feeling ambitious. Look at your financial portfolio and ask yourself honestly, how much of what I own is protected from inflation, from government interference, from the next crisis that nobody sees coming? Start small if you have to. Buy a little gold. Research index funds tied to productive companies. Learn what Bitcoin actually represents from an Austrian economics perspective. The point isn't perfection. The point is awareness. Because the moment you start thinking beyond the system, everything changes. And if this video made you see the world even slightly differently, if something clicked, if something made you uncomfortable in the best possible way, then do one simple thing. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Every single week we go deeper. More ideas, more history, more tools to help you understand the world and protect what you've built. Don't miss the next video, because what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about wealth, freedom, and who really controls your financial future. Because your financial freedom isn't someone else's responsibility. It never was. It's yours, and it starts with how you think. If this video changed the way you see the world, there's a lot more where that came from. Subscribe to Beyond the System and turn on notifications. Every week, a new idea that the system never wanted you to discover. Beyond the System. Question everything. Own your fuck cure.